It was a beautiful sunny morning, with light streaming through the windows as if it wanted to wake up the entire world. The fresh air made everything feel so quiet and peaceful that it almost seemed strange, like the calm before a storm. My name is David, 35 years old. Like clockwork, I walked into my favorite neighborhood cafe, a cozy little spot with the smell of toasted bread blending perfectly with the aroma of coffee. The elderly couple who owned the place always greeted me with their warm smiles. My routine hadn't changed: black coffee, 2 eggs, toast, and my usual seat in the corner where the sunlight always hit just right. But today, there was an added, special detail at my table: my red MAGA, Make America Great Again, hat. I knew this hat had the power to stir emotions in others. But isn't freedom of expression a basic right? I didn't dwell on it. I just wanted to enjoy my breakfast. But there was something strange in the air, like a sharp gaze cutting through the back of my head. That feeling made me glance around. And in that moment, I realized this peaceful morning was about to turn into a storm. I had just sat down, not even taken my first sip of coffee, when the cafe door swung open. The sharp clatter of high heels echoed on the tiled floor, like a declaration that someone had arrived to command attention. And there she was, a woman in her 50s, with perfectly styled hair, crimson lipstick, and a large handbag swinging with each determined step. But it wasn't her appearance that stood out. It was her energy, a commanding aura, as if she were the moral authority for the entire neighborhood. Her eyes scanned the room like a radar seeking a target. When they landed on me, I immediately knew I'd been locked on. My red MAGA hat might as well have been a neon sign screaming for her attention. Without hesitation, she strode directly toward my table. Each click of her heels on the floor felt like the suspenseful soundtrack to a thriller. She stopped in front of me, crossed her arms, and stared down with a look of pure judgment. "Do you really think it's appropriate to wear that hat here?" she said, her voice cold and cutting through the peaceful morning air. I put my coffee cup down, looked up at her, and offered a polite smile. "Good morning. How are you today?" But instead of taking it as a cordial start to a conversation, she saw it as provocation. Her eyes narrowed, her lips pressed into a tight line. "Don't play smart with me. That hat is a symbol of division, and you should be ashamed to wear it." I sighed and tried to keep my tone calm. "I'm just here to have breakfast. How about you? How's your day going?" My response only seemed to fuel her outrage. "Breakfast? You think this is just about breakfast? You're openly insulting every decent person here." Then, in a theatrical climax, she rummaged through her handbag, pulled out her phone, and began recording. "This is all going on the record. People need to see this. Your complete irresponsibility." I stifled a laugh, straightened up, and took a bite of toast. "You're recording me eating breakfast? That doesn't sound like the most captivating content." But she didn't stop. After muttering something to herself while tapping her phone, she placed it to her ear. That's when it hit me. She was calling the police. "Hello. I'd like to report an incident. There's a man causing a disturbance at this cafe. He's being aggressive and threatening everyone with his behavior." I froze. Aggressive? Threatening? Me? The air in the cafe grew tense as customers began to take notice. A few discreetly pulled out their phones to record the scene. I glanced at her, doing my best to keep my frustration in check. But inside, I knew one thing for certain. My peaceful morning had just officially turned into a storm. Karen wasn't content with just recording a video. She was determined to escalate her dramatic performance to new heights. Her hand shook slightly as she raised her phone, clutching it as if it were the ultimate piece of evidence in a high-profile case. Her expression was a mix of righteous indignation and triumphant certainty. And when she spoke, her voice rang out loud and sharp, demanding attention from everyone in the cafe. "Everyone, pay attention," she declared, her tone as commanding as a news anchor delivering a breaking story. "This man is a threat to the community." The cafe seemed to freeze in time. Conversations abruptly stopped mid-sentence. Forks and coffee cups were set down in silence, and a handful of curious faces turned in my direction. Others, however, deliberately avoided her gaze, their body language silently pleading not to be dragged into whatever storm she was brewing. From behind the counter, the cafe's owner, Mrs. Hernandez, stepped forward. Her usual warm demeanor was still intact, but her smile carried a hint of worry as she attempted to mediate the rapidly growing tension. "Ma'am, what's going on here? Could you please explain calmly?" Karen spun on her heel to face Mrs. Hernandez, her expression radiating unwavering determination, as if she were about to deliver a closing argument in court. "Don't you see?" she said, her voice rising with every word. "This man," she jabbed a finger in my direction, "is sitting here, wearing a symbol of division and hatred. He's insulting everyone here just by existing in this space. Don't you care about the safety and well-being of your customers?" Mrs. Hernandez tilted her head slightly, confusion flickering across her face, though her tone remained gentle. "David is a regular at this cafe. He's always polite and well-behaved. I really don't think there's any issue here." Karen inhaled deeply, visibly trying to calm herself, though her clenched fists betrayed her efforts. It was clear she wasn't going to let this go. With a dramatic flourish, she reached into her handbag, retrieved her phone, and began dialing a number. "If no one else is going to take this seriously," she announced loudly, "then I will. We can't just let people like him get away with this." I stayed seated, reaching for my coffee with deliberate calmness, taking a slow sip to emphasize my indifference to her escalating theatrics. My goal was simple: stay composed and let her unravel herself. Karen's voice pierced through the air like an alarm bell, cutting through the silence. "Hello. Yes, I'd like to report an emergency," she said, her tone sharp and panicked. "There's a man here at a local cafe who's threatening the safety of the community. He's acting aggressively and being disruptive, spouting extremist views and provoking people." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, the tension in the cafe was almost suffocating. Mrs. Hernandez, refusing to give up on diffusing the situation, took another step forward, her voice calm and patient. "Ma'am, I really think there's been a misunderstanding. David hasn't done anything wrong, and there's no reason to call the police over this." But Karen wasn't interested in reason. She waved Mrs. Hernandez off without so much as a glance, raising her voice for maximum impact. "Yes, the address is 123 Maple Street," she said firmly into the phone. "Please send someone immediately. We're all very concerned about this." Murmurs began rippling through the cafe. Some customers whispered to each other, sneaking amused glances at Karen, while others stifled chuckles at the absurdity of it all. No one dared to step in directly, though everyone seemed content to let Karen's performance run its course. I set my coffee cup down and turned my gaze toward Karen, keeping my expression neutral and calm. "You're seriously calling the police?" I asked, my voice measured. "Over a hat?" Karen didn't respond directly, though her glare was sharp enough to cut glass. To her, this was no longer just a cafe dispute. It was a battle for justice, and she was determined to emerge as the self-proclaimed hero of the day. And me? I simply picked up my fork, cut another piece of toast, and popped it into my mouth, fully aware that the real drama was yet to unfold. The distant wail of sirens cut through the quiet morning, an unmistakable herald that the drama brewing inside the cafe was about to reach its apex. The sound grew louder, the tension inside thick enough to cut with a knife. All eyes darted toward the door as the flashing lights outside reflected off the windows, Moments later, the cafe door swung open with a jingle, and in walked two police officers. The first was an older man with a thick mustache that looked like it had seen decades of service. His calm demeanor suggested he'd dealt with his fair share of peculiar calls. The second was younger, his expression one of weariness, like someone who had been called in for one too many trivial matters during his shift. Karen practically launched herself at them, moving with the theatrical flair of an actress stepping into her climactic scene. "Oh, thank goodness you're here," she exclaimed, her voice ringing out dramatically, thick with indignation and urgency. She gestured wildly in my direction, her finger practically shaking with accusation. "That man, he's the problem. He's deliberately causing a disturbance, acting aggressively, and making everyone here feel threatened." The older officer raised an eyebrow and looked me over. His eyes lingered momentarily on the red hat perched on my head before turning back to Karen. "And how exactly is he causing a disturbance, ma'am?" he asked, his tone calm but laced with a hint of skepticism. "What has he done?" Karen drew a deep breath, visibly preparing to deliver her monologue. "He's wearing that hat," she said, her voice rising with each word, "a symbol of division and hatred. He looked at me, provocatively, and he's intentionally making everyone here uncomfortable. I genuinely feel unsafe." The younger officer shifted his weight slightly, his face a careful mask of neutrality, though his brow furrowed ever so slightly. He turned to me. "Sir," he said evenly, "is there anything you'd like to say about this?" I set my coffee cup down, taking a deliberate moment to make eye contact with both officers. Offering a small, polite smile, I said, "Not much to say, officer. I'm just sitting here having breakfast, coffee, toast, eggs, the usual." She came up to me, started yelling about my hat, and, well, now here we are. Both officers exchanged a brief glance before looking back at Karen, who was standing with her arms crossed, radiating indignation. The older officer tilted his head slightly. "So, aside from wearing a hat you don't like, he hasn't done anything else, correct?" Karen's eyes widened, as if the question itself were an affront. "No, it's not just the hat," she exclaimed, her voice shaking with frustration. "It's his attitude, the way he's sitting there. It's so smug, so provocative." The younger officer's lips twitched slightly, as though suppressing a smile, but he kept his tone steady. "Sitting there? Eating breakfast?" he asked, his voice tinged with a hint of disbelief. "Ma'am, are you sure that's why you called us here?" Karen's face flushed a deeper shade of red, her voice trembling as she tried to hold her ground. "You don't understand. That hat, what it represents, it's offensive. It's a threat to all of us." The older officer let out a measured sigh and pulled out a small notebook from his pocket. "Ma'am," he began, his voice carrying the patient weariness of someone who had been through this too many times. "What you're describing doesn't constitute any criminal behavior. There's been no threats, no violence. Feeling offended is your personal perspective, but it's not a legal issue." Karen opened her mouth, then closed it, seemingly grasping for words that wouldn't come. Finally, she stammered, "So, you're not going to do anything? He can just sit here, wearing that hat, and no one's going to stop him?" The younger officer shrugged, a hint of sarcasm slipping into his otherwise professional tone. "Ma'am, we're here to handle actual disturbances, not to mediate debates about fashion choices." The cafe, which had been holding its collective breath, finally exhaled. A few scattered chuckles rippled through the room, light and barely contained. Karen's face turned scarlet as she glanced around, looking for support, but all she found were amused smiles or deliberately averted gazes. The older officer closed his notebook with a soft snap and turned to me. "Sir, I'm sorry for the inconvenience," he said, his tone courteous. "Please enjoy the rest of your breakfast." I nodded politely. "Thank you, officers. You have a good day." Karen remained frozen in place, her fists clenched at her sides. As the officers turned to leave, the younger one paused at the door and glanced back. He leaned slightly toward me and said, just loud enough for me to hear, "Nice hat." I couldn't help but smile, lifting my coffee for another sip as they walked out. The storm had passed, but the morning was anything but calm now. As the officers finished their questioning, the cafe felt like a stage, with every eye in the room glued to Karen. The earlier murmurs of quiet conversations and clinking cutlery had been replaced by a silence so heavy you could almost hear her breathing. The older officer, having closed his notebook with a deliberate snap, tilted his head slightly and fixed her with a steady gaze. His tone was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge of challenge in his voice. "Let me get this straight. Ma'am," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "You called us here because you don't like his hat. Is that correct?" Karen blinked rapidly, her expression flickering between outrage and panic. She clearly hadn't anticipated the officers boiling down her elaborate accusations into such a blunt statement. Her hands fluttered slightly, as though trying to grasp for a response. "No, it's not just the hat," she finally burst out, her voice rising with every word until it was just shy of a yell. "It's what it represents. It's offensive to all of us." The younger officer crossed his arms over his chest and raised an eyebrow, his posture a mix of professionalism and mild disbelief. "Offensive? Because he's sitting here, eating breakfast, wearing a hat you don't like?" he asked, his tone neutral but with a faint, almost imperceptible hint of amusement. That's it. By this point, the rest of the cafe had settled into an odd rhythm of barely suppressed amusement. The regulars, who had seen Karen's antics before, were clearly more entertained than concerned. A man at a nearby table leaned over to his companion, his voice low but deliberately loud enough for Karen to hear. "I thought the cops were only supposed to show up for, actual crimes. Didn't know we had a breakfast dress code enforcer in town." Karen's face flushed a deep, angry red as she whipped around to glare at the man, her lips parting as though to issue a sharp retort. But whatever she planned to say died in her throat when he raised his eyebrows innocently and went back to his coffee. Turning back to the officers, Karen's eyes took on a pleading quality as she tried to regain control of the situation. "You have to do something," she insisted, her voice cracking under the weight of her indignation. "This is completely unacceptable. I can't believe you're just going to let him sit there and get away with this. You're siding with him?" The younger officer let out a short breath, his lips twitching slightly as though suppressing a smile. "Siding with who, ma'am?" he asked, a faint note of sarcasm slipping into his otherwise professional tone. "We're siding with the law, and as far as I know, there's no law against wearing a hat. Maybe next time, think a little harder before you call us out for something like this." Karen's face tightened, her cheeks glowing a shade of crimson that rivaled my hat. She glanced around the room, scanning for allies, but found only politely averted gazes or barely contained grins. Her desperation mounted as she threw her arms out wide. "Doesn't anyone see this as wrong? Doesn't anyone agree with me?" A ripple of suppressed laughter coursed through the cafe. Finally, a woman at the corner table, sipping leisurely on her latte, decided to speak up. Her voice was calm, almost amused, but her words landed like a hammer. "We're standing with good coffee and a peaceful breakfast. Thank you very much." The laughter was less stifled now, small chuckles and murmurs breaking the tension that had suffused the room moments earlier. Karen stomped her foot like a petulant child, her face now the color of a ripe tomato. But despite her apparent fury, she seemed unable to find the words to defend herself further. The officers exchanged a brief glance before the older one turned to me. He nodded politely, his demeanor now lighter as though the situation had resolved itself. "Enjoy the rest of your breakfast, sir," he said, his voice courteous but tinged with relief. I nodded back, picking up my coffee with a small smile. "Thank you, officers. Have a great day." Karen remained rooted in place, her fists clenching and unclenching at her sides. For a moment, it seemed like she might launch into another tirade, but instead, as the officers turned to leave, she spun on her heel and made her way toward the door. Just before stepping out, she turned back, her voice sharp and defiant in one last desperate attempt to reclaim her dignity. "I'll post this online," she shouted. "Everyone will know the truth about what happened here." I raised my coffee cup and took a slow sip, my movements calm and deliberate. Without bothering to look up, I replied, "You do what you need to do. I just need more cream." The cafe erupted in laughter, the tension dissolving completely as Karen stormed out, the door slamming shut behind her. As Karen stepped out of the cafe in a huff, I allowed myself a moment of relief. The storm seemed to have passed, the atmosphere gradually settling back into its usual hum of clinking cups and quiet conversations. But just as I thought the morning drama was behind me, the door jingled open again. This time, it wasn't an enraged customer or an officer returning with more questions. No, the man who stepped inside carried an air of authority and poise that instantly commanded attention. Mark Sullivan. Mark, a senior advisor to the governor and one of the most respected figures in the state, strode into the cafe with the confidence of someone who had never needed to ask for a seat at any table. Dressed in a sharp gray suit, he looked like he had just stepped out of a high-stakes meeting. His polished leather shoes barely made a sound on the cafe's tiled floor, but his presence alone was loud enough to draw every eye in the room. When his gaze landed on me, his face lit up with a warm smile. "David, my friend," he called out, his voice carrying easily over the quiet murmur of the cafe. "What a surprise to see you here." I stood as he approached, and he extended his hand, shaking mine firmly before giving me a friendly pat on the shoulder. His greeting was so genuine, so full of camaraderie, that it felt as though we'd known each other for decades. His arrival immediately shifted the energy in the room. Customers who had been preoccupied with their breakfasts now turned their attention to us. Their curiosity piqued. Mark didn't waste any time launching into conversation. "I was just telling the governor this morning how impressed I was with your proposal," he said, his voice resonant and full of pride. "Your approach to educational reform is exactly what we need right now." I told him that people like you are the reason we'll see real change in this state. I nodded, offering a small smile. But before I could respond, movement near the door caught my eye. Karen. She hadn't left. She stood frozen just inside the doorway, her face a mixture of disbelief and barely contained panic. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a stark realization. The man she had just targeted wasn't just some random diner patron. He was someone connected to power, someone with influence, and someone clearly respected by a man like Mark Sullivan. Mark noticed her too, his sharp gaze flicking to her briefly before he turned back to me, his tone shifting slightly. "Apologies if I interrupted something," he said, though his voice carried a subtle weight. "Everything okay here?" Karen stammered, visibly struggling to find her footing. Her earlier bravado was gone, replaced by a weak attempt at salvaging what little dignity she thought she had left. "I just thought that," she began, her words trailing off as she glanced nervously around the room, searching for support that wasn't there. Mark's smile faded, replaced by an expression of calm authority. His voice, while still measured, took on an edge that left no room for argument. "You thought you had the right to judge someone based on their appearance, didn't you?" he said, his words precise and razor-sharp. "I don't know all the details of what happened here, but I know David. He's one of the most dedicated, intelligent, and passionate individuals I've ever worked with. And let me be clear, you were completely wrong to treat him the way you did." Karen's face turned an alarming shade of pale, her eyes darting from Mark to me and then around the cafe, desperately seeking some form of backup, but there was none. The other patrons, who had endured her earlier tirade, were now watching silently, their expressions ranging from amused to quietly satisfied. Mark wasn't finished. He straightened slightly, his tone firm but not unkind, like a teacher delivering a lesson to a particularly difficult student. "A community isn't built on criticism and division," he continued, his words ringing with authority. "It's built on understanding and collaboration. Maybe you should think about that next time." Karen opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. Whatever retort she might have had dissolved under the weight of the moment. With a barely audible mumble, she turned on her heel and marched out of the cafe, her exit punctuated by the jingle of the door. The silence in the cafe broke as a ripple of quiet laughter spread among the customers. A few exchanged knowing smiles, while others simply went back to their meals, their breakfasts somehow tasting better after watching the dramatic reversal. Mark turned back to me, his warm smile returning as though the previous exchange hadn't just occurred. "You've got some patience," he said with a chuckle. "If it were me, I don't think I could have kept my cool like that." I shrugged, lifting my coffee cup with a small grin. Breakfast still tastes good, so I wasn't about to let anyone ruin it. Mark laughed, a deep, hearty sound that seemed to dispel any lingering tension in the room. "That's what I admire about you, David. You always manage to see the bright side of things," he said. Then, leaning in slightly, he lowered his voice with a conspiratorial wink. "By the way, nice hat." I couldn't help but laugh as he clapped me on the shoulder and turned to leave. His exit, though less dramatic than Karen's, left an unmistakable mark on the room. The atmosphere had lightened considerably, and as I settled back into my seat, I noticed a few patrons giving me nods of approval or friendly smiles. Mark Sullivan hadn't just defused the situation, he had turned it into a moment of quiet triumph. Sometimes, I thought as I sipped my now lukewarm coffee, victory doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from being surrounded by people who truly understand your worth. When Mark left, he left behind an entirely different atmosphere. The ripple of quiet laughter still seemed to linger in the air, and everyone in the cafe appeared as though they just witnessed an unexpectedly dramatic play. A few customers even came over to my table. "You handled that really well," said an older man, nodding in admiration. "I don't think I could have stayed as calm as you if I'd been in your shoes." Another woman, holding a latte, offered a gentle smile. I recorded a little bit of what happened. Maybe it'll help show people that baseless judgment doesn't do anyone any good. I smiled and thanked them before turning back to my now cold coffee. But it wasn't the coffee I was savoring. It was the sense of relief that everything had blown over and that the truth had spoken for itself. My gaze drifted to the window, where the morning sunlight still poured in brightly, as though nothing had happened at all. A thought passed through my mind. What had just unfolded wasn't merely a personal confrontation. It was a testament to the fact that patience and honesty can withstand any attack, no matter who it's from or why it occurs. Mrs. Hernandez walked over to my table, placing a fresh cup of coffee and a small plate of cookies in front of me. "This one's on the house," she said, her smile gentle yet warm. "You handled that wonderfully, David. I think everyone here felt it." I nodded, lifting the new cup of coffee, and thanked her once again. Everything returned to normal, or perhaps even better than before. I knew that, out there, this story might spread, but it would spread in a way that let the truth, not judgment, be heard. Sometimes, victory doesn't come from retaliation, but from staying composed and letting the truth do the talking. I leaned back in my chair, sipped the warm coffee, let the faint sweetness linger on my tongue, and smiled. Life sometimes puts us in unexpected situations where our patience and sincerity are tested. In such moments, don't let judgment or insults drag you down. Instead, let calmness and truth be your guide. You don't need to argue or prove anything. Just stay true to your values, and the world will eventually see who's right and who's wrong. Always hold on to your resilience and your belief in what's good. May you have enough patience to overcome challenges, enough strength to stand up for the truth, and enough love to spread positivity in every situation. Life is a journey, and stories like this one only make you stronger and more steadfast. Wishing you peace and happiness every single day.